The discourse on this issue, the mainstream discourse, has become so absurd. So you have things like the acceptance of Zionism, for example, which is, of course, the philosophy or the ideology that brought about the state of Israel, which states that the Jewish people, because they are related to the ancient Hebrews that lived in that land some 2,000-3,000 years ago, have a right to go and live there. And the word that they use is they have a right to return. As though we just left a few minutes ago, now we're returning. We, the Jews today. And you wonder how they were able to sell this at all, and today this is part of the discourse. Jews have a right to return. Even though there's not a single Jew who can trace their roots back to the ancient Hebrews. But this has become, this absurd notion has become part of the discourse. It becomes even more absurd when you bring in the issue of the right of return of Palestinians, because the claim, the Israeli claim against it, or the excuse they use, is that it was too long ago. This happened so long ago that the Palestinians need to forget. So people whose claim is 3,000 years old are telling people who are still alive, who still have the keys to their homes, that they can't go back because it was too long ago. They need to forget. But this is the discourse. This is how people talk about this. The mainstream discourse about Palestine, this is what it's about. And the other aspect of this that's absurd is that if you criticize Israel, not to mention if you reject Zionism altogether, then you must be anti-Semitic. So if you're anti-Semitic, if you criticize Israel, what do you call somebody who doesn't criticize Israel? Because if you accept Israel, that means you're accepting a state that has racist laws, you're accepting a state that has thousands of political prisoners, and you're accepting a state that allows itself to regularly, on a regular basis, bomb innocent civilians, knowing full well they'll kill innocent civilians. So what do you call somebody who supports that? If opposing it is anti-Semitism, what is it called when you support this sort of thing? You know, and so of course this is again, once again, it's perfectly acceptable. This is the way. This is the foundation of the discourse on this issue today in America and in the West in general. And this is an absurdity that I think has to be exposed and changed. I was thinking about this issue of the personal transformation, and I think a big part of that is actually maturity and a political awareness. Although part of it is a personal transformation, of course, as well. But really, it's a maturity and a moving away from accepting the myth, this wonderful myth of the heroic and small David fighting and beating Goliath. And we as Israelis, we like to see ourselves, of course, as the descendants of David and the descendants of the Maccabees, who, of course, defeated great empires and so on. And to grow up and mature and go beyond the myth. And certainly Ilan in his books and his work has helped a lot in doing this. But you have to have the desire and the ability to open the book and read it. So I was thinking about it, and I think, I tried to identify several stages, and I think the first stage is a seed. There has to be a seed, or in my case, there was a seed that was planted at some point in my childhood, and there's a story that I talk about in the book about my mother. And it's a story that she told me many, many times as I was growing up, how in 1948, she was already a young mother, she was living in a small apartment with her mother, and as the Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem, not the old city, but in the neighborhoods outside the old city, were taken by the Zionist forces, and the population who had to leave, the Palestinian population had to leave, these homes were made available to Israeli families. And of course, she was the wife of an officer. Her husband, my father, was, fighting for the cause. He was in the front lines. She was offered one of these homes. And her reaction, and again, I don't remember when she told me the story the first time. I remember it as a child. I remember it my whole life. The way she tells the story, even to this day when she talks about it, it brings up the same emotion in her. And the emotion is, how could I possibly take the home of another mother? How could I possibly take the home of another family? And then she always goes on to describe the looting, the trucks that the soldiers used to loot the houses, because these are well-to-do families, well-to-do homes, beautiful homes, by the way, that are still there. And the furniture, the rugs, and you may have seen there was a documentary about the books, the rare books that were stolen as well, thousands of manuscripts. And she talks about it with pain. But the thing about the story is not so much the story itself, but I remember as a child it was always troubling to me. There was something troubling about the story. And it wasn't until actually I was working on the book and talking to her about this again and again that I realized the problem with her story is that it was contradicting the national narrative. Because the narrative is, they rejected the partition plan, then they attacked us, then we defeated them, they are the Arabs of course, and then we asked them to stay and they left. We asked them to stay and they left. This is the narrative. Well, if this is true, then there's no moral issue with taking a house. They left on their own accord, we won, what are you going to do? She was presenting a moral dilemma. And I couldn't quite understand that moral dilemma. How does it fit in with this story? With the story of the narrative. The other problem with her story is that there was no justification at the end. In Israeli discourse, typically, even when we acknowledge an atrocity, there's always a good ending. There's always some kind of a justification. So in Israeli school books, for example, children learn about the massacre at Deir Yassin. But the end of the story is that Chaim Weizmann, who was the first president of the State of Israel, said that although the massacre was a terrible thing, thanks to the massacre, thousands of Palestinians left, and that allowed us to become a majority, us the Jews to create a majority in our new state. So in the end, this was a good thing. Even though the massacre was a bad thing, there was a good outcome for us. When my mother was telling this story, there was no good ending. It was wrong to do. There was no justification. And this was very strange to me as a child, because again, putting it, or hearing this and learning the national narrative at the same time. So that was probably the first seed. And there was also the sense of how it wasn't okay to do it because they were Arabs. It was wrong to do it because it's wrong to do, period. Which again is very uncommon in the discourse, Israeli discourse, when we talk about Palestinians. So that was the seed. I would say the maturation of that seed and the maturity of the process was when I began to realize the work that my father had done. My father, like you heard, he was an officer in 1948 when the State of Israel was established. He remained and was an officer in the Israeli army. And 20 years later, in 1967, he was already a general. And he was one of the generals who led and pushed, very powerfully pushed, very decisively pushed for the war, insisting that Israel must engage in a preemptive strike. But when the war was over, and I won't get into the details of the war and all the history and all that, but when the war was over, he stood up and he said, well, now we have an opportunity to solve the Palestinian problem. This was right at the very end, the very last days of the war. At the very first meeting of the Israeli High Command, and he said, now there's no one between us, and we can talk to the Palestinians directly and allow them to establish a state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And this was really the beginning of the two-state solution, the idea of the two-state solution. He said, if we don't do this now, then we will end up being occupiers of millions of Palestinians. Eventually they will resist, we'll have to fight the resistance. Our jails will be filled with political prisoners, with terrorists, so to speak. And eventually Israel will become a binational state. I said this in 1967. And then he dedicated the rest of his life to accomplishing that, in other words, the right to self-determination for the Palestinians and equality for the Palestinians who are citizens of the State of Israel. And so as I was growing up, the next stage of my growing up, kind of into high school years and so forth, my father was involved with that, and understanding what he was doing and where he was going with this was kind of the maturation of the process. The maturity, it reached maturity. But that's not enough. I think for real transformation, there's a couple more steps. And I think the next step for me was the shock. You have to have some kind of a shock that propels you, or at least propelled me, into activism. And the shock was when my sister's little girl was killed in a suicide attack. It's a kind of a shock that completely changes everything you do and how you see the world. And the problem with that is, of course, that you can't stop living, you can't stop working, you can't stop raising your children, you have to go on with life, but you really can't. So you have to do something different. You have to do something. And my good fortune was I was already living in the U.S. She was killed in 1997, September of 1997, a suicide attack. I was living in the United States already, and I was very fortunate that I was able to find a Jewish-Palestinian discussion group or dialogue group. Now, there are several things that were significant in that. First of all, it was the first time I ever met Palestinians. In the book, I talk about, my journey into Palestine began in San Diego when I was 39 years old. Now, I grew up in Jerusalem, which is a mixed city. But of course, as I'm sure you know if you've been there, it's a very segregated city. It's a very racist city. So the first time I actually met Palestinians, I was living in the United States, in San Diego. But not only was it the first time that I met Palestinians, it was the first time that I was around Palestinians and we were equal. In other words, the laws that governed their lives and the laws that governed my life were exactly the same, and that doesn't exist over there. Of course, they didn't need a permit, they didn't have checkpoints, there was no curfew that they had to meet. The laws that they lived under, the laws that I lived under were exactly the same, which is again something that I had not experienced before. And that was the time when I was finally, they kind of took me by the hand in a very gracious way, in a very generous way, and introduced me to this other country, which was called Palestine. These other people that were called Palestinians, this other narrative and the culture and everything that comes with it. And the first step was realizing that there's another story. And that the story is diametrically opposed to the story that I know. Now, Israelis in general, the story of the State of Israel, particularly what happened in 1948, and the justification of what happened in 1948 and the justification of the war of 1967 is part of our identity. It's a big part of our identity. It's a source of pride. Now, in my case, my extended family were all part of the establishment of the State of Israel. There was my father, my grandfather, other relatives who held up positions and so on, and contributed to the establishment of the state. So for me, this was even more painful. But they kind of took me in a very, there was no accusing, there was no blaming. Everybody told their story, and gradually I learned that there's this other story that's diametrically opposed to mine. And then the next step was realizing that actually the story that I came from is actually a lie. It's not true. And of course, you have to take the first step in order to get to the second step. And I began traveling in the West Bank, and I began going to see communities, Palestinian communities within Israel, which I'd never done before. In fact, I don't know, has anybody here ever seen the movie Five Broken Cameras? Yes. Okay, it talks about Bilaim. So my very first trip, and I describe this trip in the book, my very first trip to the West Bank, I was going to Bilaim, it was 2005. Somebody told me about these young Palestinians who were starting this new movement of the regular weekly protests, and I went to meet them. And I had an Israeli car with Israeli license plates. I was going to the West Bank. And if you've driven to the West Bank, it's very beautiful. It's all hills and olive groves and so forth. But all I could think of was that there must be Arabs around behind every hill and around every corner waiting to kill me. I was absolutely certain this was going to be my last day on earth. And when you think how absurd it is, it's absurd period, but I was going to Bilaim, which is of course even more absurd. And that was kind of, that was that next step. So that shock really propelled me to move in that direction and to engage. The next step, I think, was, and again, this Palestinian community in San Diego, which helped me along with this process. And talking about it now, it seems quite simple. This is a very painful process that took several years. It's a process that took several years. It was like surgery without anesthesia. It was really, really painful and very difficult, but of course very rewarding. The next step was replacing the fear with trust.
Exactly.
And somebody compared it to a baby, letting go of something and taking their first step, knowing that they're going to make it to the next stop where they can hold on to something. That's exactly what it feels like. And that first trip to Bilaim was a big step in that direction. I had to trust, I had to know that it was going to be okay. Those guys, it's going to be fine. Then taking more trips, and then participating in protests, and then going on and standing side by side, going to the other side of the wall, going through the checkpoints, being arrested, going through that whole process of knowing that it's okay to stand with the other because we're really on the same side. And probably, when I think about it now, the most compelling aspect of this trust was a friendship that I developed with a gentleman in the West Bank who was a prisoner, and he was in prison. He was actually imprisoned for killing a soldier. Now, I served in the Israeli army. I was a soldier, and the circumstances that in which this took place, this killing took place, it could have definitely been me. It could have definitely been me. There were two soldiers who were manning a post somewhere in the West Bank. This friend of mine was a young man. He and three others snuck up behind these soldiers, who, by the way, were obviously fully armed, and stabbed them to death. And here I am, you know, not that being a soldier is part of my identity, but it's something that I did do. I regret it. I admit I was, you know, it was the wrong thing to do, but there I was. And I'm standing side by side, and I've developed this really wonderful friendship with a man who did this, you know, who actually stabbed the soldier to death, which, again, in Israeli terms, it's a terrible thing. When you think about it legally, when you think about it internationally, when you think about it in terms of justice, you have to wonder who's the terrorist and who's the soldier. Because, once again, going back to the absurdity of the discourse about this issue, he is considered the terrorist, and my role in this is justified as the soldier of an occupation. I would argue that between the two of us, I was the terrorist, and he was a freedom fighter. Because my role, although it was small, I was a single soldier, but my role was to serve in this military force that has set to itself the objective of displacing Palestinians, destroying their homes, and then arresting them and killing them if they resist. And I participated in that, which is, I think characterizes terrorism. Because the entire objective of the Israeli army today is terrorism.
Exactly.
Although, of course, we have uniforms and we have commanders and so on, but it's really a glorified terror organization. My friend, on the other hand, was never served in the military force, never had a military force, but he had to resist. He couldn't take it anymore. And so they went up, and this was the act of resistance. He was arrested, beaten, tortured. He was given several life sentences, but he was exchanged in one of the big prisoner exchanges between Israel and the PLO, and that's how he was released. And again, reaching all these conclusions, this is all part of that process of developing the trust, and then moving on and getting a better understanding of whose role is and how we all fit into the story. The conclusion of the book, and the conclusion of my own conclusion, or the way my conclusion is represented in the book, is that it's the last chapter where I'm discussing with my brother-in-law, and we're talking about the solution moving forward. One state, two state, you know, what Zionism is all about, what the state of Israel is all about, what it represents, and the role of Jews, and so forth. But it's a conversation that he and I have been having since I was 12 years old. And I just kind of summarized it into one long conversation in the book. And I think when we look at it today, and we talked about this here earlier a little bit, when we look at this today, we've got an entire country, half the population is Israeli, half the population is Jewish, and everybody pretends that it's a Jewish state. And everybody pretends that you can have a Jewish state in a country where half the population is not Jewish. And it's okay. And again, once again, I go back to the absurdity of the discourse. Everybody pretends like it's okay, you can have this Jewish state, you can call it a democracy, even though it clearly is not a democracy. It clearly has the characteristics of an apartheid state. Yet everybody pretends like it's okay and we can go on with this. And I would argue that if we're looking at a solution, we have to fall back on our values. The way we view the solution to this issue has to do with our values. If we think it's okay, if we think we can support a state that has political prisoners and racist laws and kills civilians on a regular basis as a matter of policy, that's one set of values. And if that's what our values, that's what our religion tells us, then that's what it is. There's really no arguing about that. If, on the other hand, we believe in values like respecting people's human rights, respecting people's civil rights, and basically believing in equality and democracy, then we have to move away from that notion of supporting this Jewish state, or the idea of this Jewish state, in favor of a real democracy, and pushing forward to a transformation from what it is today to a real democracy that includes everyone. not killing anyone, it's not destroying anything, but it's including, it's creating inclusion, and creating a reality where everybody's included. And I would argue that this is not only the morally right thing to do, but it's also the realistic solution. So I would end by saying, by encouraging everybody to, this has kind of been my process, but I would encourage everyone who cares about this issue, whether from an Israeli point of view or a Palestinian point of view, because the solution will help everyone. The solution, everybody will end up being better off, Israelis as well as Palestinians. To really get behind the banner of a democratic state, of a transformation of this racist, non-democratic state, which is a Jewish state. And regardless of whether Jews have a right or don't have a right, that's not the issue. We have a reality we have to deal with. And focus on the transformation into a real democracy. And not be afraid to talk about it, not to be afraid by the name-calling, anti-Semitism and all that, but to really push forward because it makes a lot more sense. It is the solution that makes sense, and it is the solution, I think, that is viable and realistic. So anyway, that was kind of the story. Thank you all very much.
Once you are there, it's very liberating. You feel very good with it. It's very difficult to do this, but once you are there, you're actually much more at peace with yourself than most of them.
He said it.
He said it with yourself as an Israeli Jew, and I think this, if we would have the formula of telling people that, I think we too much stress the fact sometimes the price that has to be paid, and there is a price. There's no doubt about it. There is a price to be paid if you leave the tribe at the time that it is in a war with another tribe in its own narrative. It's tantamount to treason. There's no doubt about it. And we are still treated, Miko and I, as traitors in our country. Don't forget that. I mean, that's something that would deter quite a lot of Israeli Jews. Even if they feel like we do, that something has to be done, they know that they will immediately be depicted as traitors. But if we would find a way of conveying that there's something far more rewarding, something far more satisfying, and something more profound and long-standing than these accusations and allegations that anyway disappear after a while, then I think we can succeed in recruiting many more to this kind of a position. Because with this I would end, in this age of internet, of multitude of TV channels, of people around the world telling any Israeli who travels that they are at best worried about what goes on in Israel, at worst abhorred by what Israel is doing. And a lot of Israelis are traveling. Every fourth Israeli is going twice a year abroad. The information is there. The knowledge of what is going on is there. I think if there would be also a promise for not just a painful transformation, but also a liberating transformation, then I think we will be able to change more drastically and more significantly the attitude of Israeli Jews towards the reality in which they live. Others have agency in this as well. Of course, the Palestinians have an agency for that to happen. Europeans and Americans have agencies. But I think, of course, the onus is on the Israeli Jews themselves to go through that transformation. And if this is the name of the NGO in many ways, or it's not the name of the NGO.
Facilitate Global?
Yeah, Facilitate Global. Well, it means synonym of the NGO. I think that that's a very good framework for thinking of what to do, which is a bit novel, which is a bit fresh, which is a bit new in a campaign of solidarity that I think has exhausted every possible tactics and means, and yet not one square inch of Palestine is liberated, not one Israeli political figure or Western political figure is willing to say anything of significance about the reality. So I think we have to keep thinking of fresh angles, of new angles. We cannot continue what we are doing because the results are not very impressive. And I think that this kind move, like the civil disobedience, like the movements that we see today in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and inside Israel, may begin to show a different paradigm also of action that builds on previous liberation efforts, but adds something new that is more appropriate for the 21st century, and hopefully also takes into account all the changes on the ground that happen in Israel and Palestine. After all, it is a settler colonialist society that has already a third generation of settlers. And you cannot think like Ahmadinejad that the third generation of settlers would go home, they have no home but the home that they have settled in. And you cannot think as a settler colonialist society that you can, if you don't genocide the natives, you can convince them forever to be colonized. These two things will not happen. The settler colonialists will not leave the colony. The colonized will not, at any given moment, agree to continue to be colonized. It can be mad and mutual assured destruction, or it can be a way of creating, as Miko suggested, and I think that's the only solution, one democratic state for everyone who's there, and to reframe the relationship on an equal footing, very much like Miko Peled in San Diego. And I know this feeling when you are an Israeli, you're suddenly in a space when you are not the superior, you don't have the legal rights, the historical rights to feel superior, to be equal in a state of equality. We have to create this equality that we felt in San Diego, to create it on the ground in Israel and Palestine. It's not much to ask, it's just a lot of work together. Thank you.
My name is Jafar Amiri. I'm a Palestinian from Jenin. I live in London, not by choice. In view of the results of the recent Israeli elections and the move to the right, do you see any hope or any accommodation between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
Good question.
It's interesting, you know, when you read Israeli analyses, they will tell you that actually the shift after the elections is more to the center, not to the right. In an Israeli sense, there's something in it. Netanyahu did not come out as the great winner of these elections, and a kind of the center party took his place. But I think you're right. I don't think the elections indicated the shift to the right. I think Israel is moving all the time to the right since its inception. And so I would not focus on the last elections as a particular obstacle. To my mind, the obstacle is how we view 1967. The obstacle is not so much the Israeli right. The Israeli right is very clear. It's very easy to analyze it as an extreme, almost fascist, unbecoming ideological movement in universal terms. That's not the problem. The problem is the Israeli center and left. And I think that's the worry thing about the elections, that it seems now that as if the center, at least the center in Israel, is back in power. And I think it all comes back to 1967. If you analyze the Israeli political positions according to what people feel about the occupied territories, you create the impression as if there is a real serious debate in Israel between two camps. The one that wants to withdraw from the West Bank, it's only the West Bank now, from the West Bank, and those who want to keep the West Bank. This debate didn't really ever take place seriously in Israel. And in real historical terms, 67 was the continuation of 1948. And in this respect, the problem is the paradigm of peace that the West has adopted, and quite a few Palestinians have adopted. That's the root of the problem today. not the Israeli election. The root of the problem is that the international community has adopted, and as I said, quite a few Palestinians have, adopted a paradigm that says that if the Israeli left comes to power and agrees to a two-state solution, then the conflict is over. And this is a false assumption, this is a false description, and I think that what we have to concentrate now is of how do we convince people that this paradigm is not only dead, because it's not working anymore, but it's a very dangerous paradigm that would allow Israel to complete the dispossession and ruination of Palestine.
I agree with Ilan with what he said completely. I'll just add to that. You know, if you take a look at the most left-wing liberal government that Israel has ever had, the most peace-leaning government that Israel had ever had, and we take a look at what they were willing to do, they had stated very clearly 3 issues that were absolute no on these 3 issues. The first one is negotiating on the Jordan River Valley. The second one is negotiating on the expanded boundaries of Jerusalem. And the third one is negotiating on the major settlement blocks. These 3 no's are an absolute no to a Palestinian state. Because these 3 no's mean there is no West Bank. So even the most left-leaning, peace-leaning, liberal Zionist government was not willing to make peace with the Palestinians based on the most minimal requirements for peace, which would be a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And so I would take it further and say there is no, I think it was important to recognize, is the paradigm that there could be peace with the Zionist state, or between the Zionist state and the Palestinians, is false. So the Zionist state is about keeping the land of Israel for the Jews and displacing and dispossessing the Palestinians. That's the name of the game, and it's a zero-sum game. There is no possibility for peace as long as there is a state of Israel.
Exactly.
As long as there is a Zionist state. And I think, like Ilan was saying, the West doesn't want to recognize this, doesn't want to say this, and many Palestinians don't necessarily accept this either. But I think it's important to realize that it's a difficult way. But there will not be peace as long as this Zionist paradigm exists, because it says the Zionists, for the Zionists, this is a zero-sum game. They will not compromise on anything. Well, if I wasn't hopeful, if I didn't think that this would happen in all of our lifetimes, I wouldn't be here speaking. I think it would be a complete waste of time to talk about this if there was no hope. If there's no hope, we could all stay home and do something else. I don't know that anybody can give guarantees about anything. But I think that it's perfectly realistic. It's perfectly realistic to expect that this transformation will take place in all of our lifetimes. And I said this in a lecture before, and there was an older lady, and she said, well, I'm 78 years old, so does that include me? I think the thing is, of course, it's not going to happen on its own. If we all sit down and wait for it to happen, nothing's going to happen. If we want to affect this change, then we have to be willing to get dirty, we have to be willing to get muddy, we have to be willing to engage in a struggle. Because it is a struggle. And it's going to be a tough, uphill struggle. Israel is not going to disappear and die. At the same time, apartheid in South Africa was very strong. Hosni Mubarak was very strong. And I've been talking to a lot of activists who were involved with the anti-apartheid movement, both here and in the U.S. A year, 2 years before apartheid fell, if someone suggested that apartheid would fall in 2 years, they would put him in an asylum. So we don't know when this is going to happen, but we have to be willing to continue the struggle, to say these things, to think beyond this paradigm, to be willing to say that Israel is the obstacle to peace. We have to think beyond the state of Israel. It doesn't mean we're talking about killing all Israelis. We're talking about including everybody in the process. And that's also equally important because everybody gets paranoid that they might be compared to Ahmadinejad. But I think it's important to make it absolutely clear. And like I said, to me, I think it's very hopeful. I think there are changes taking place, like Ilan described earlier. And but we have to do something. And if we're hopeless, we're going to sit at home. If we have hope, then we will do something. And I think we can do certainly more than what we've been doing. But there's no question. I can't guarantee it, but I'll wager that you and I will be able to go back, and you'll be able to go back to Palestine.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
The same answer.
Thank you so much.
No guarantees.
Have to draw the line.
Thank you. Exactly.
Thank you. My name is Khalifa. I'm from Gaza originally. I've been living here now for the last 35 years. In one of our visits, we went to America, to Florida. And while we were there, the name of Israel came more than once. Not because I'm non-Palestinian, they were just talking general terms. And the sympathy for Israel was unbelievable, really. The Palestinian was just unbelievable. And I just want to know, somehow the Palestinians have not won the moral argument of our right of existence and our right of equality with the Israelis. And I don't know how to click the right tone with the word, to convince the world that how are we as equal or as good or as bad as the Israelis. We have not played our game right. And I just don't know how to sell the Palestinian cause to the typical average American person or the typical average Western person. I don't know what can one say or what the moral grounds to say to win that argument. Because I think, in my judgment, as a Palestinian and British, if we won that argument, then we won the equality issue and we won our country. What the tone can we read? What other the core message we can give to the world that you can win it in one sentence? We don't have that one. Unfortunately, we haven't sold our cause. We have not sold one crunchy point, one sentence. We have not created that sentence. Once we create that sentence of our right, I think we win the argument. Thank you.
Who's going to take that one?
I'm not sure it's a matter of soundbite. I think it's, from the very beginning, I'm thinking about the very beginning of Zionism. It's quite surprising how many, contrary to what I thought and many others thought, how many Palestinians understood what Zionism was all about. It's quite amazing. If you go and read the newspaper Philistine, it came out in 1911 in Jaffa.
That's right.
You see, in the first year, they still are not interested in Zionism. It's in page 3, page 4. In 1912, a year after, they devote a whole supplement every week for Zionism. And they say very clearly, if we, the Palestinians, will not be aware of what goes on, it will end with the dispossession of Palestine. They say it in such clear ways, and you ask yourself, if the analysis in 1912 was so right, why the prognosis was so wrong? And you know the answers. The answers have to do with clannish politics, with British policy, with the Holocaust. What you see is actually, historically, that every year that passes by, from 1882 until today, the fact that Zionism was not opposed in the very beginning makes it more formidable, almost winning immunity in a sense. On the other hand, I don't think it's true to say that the Palestinian struggle does not include, to my understanding, a process of inner learning. I think it does. I don't think, as I pointed before, that the American and Western public in general is the same American and Western public 10 or 15 years ago. For historians, 60 years is not even a second. For someone who lived and was expelled, a second is a lifetime. So I can understand it. But I think historically speaking, there are positive developments. I only see it totally pessimistic as you do. I'll give you one example. With this I will have. But before the example, I would say that if you notice, Israel is standing on two pillars, the moral pillar and the material pillar. The material pillar is its military strength, the American financial aid, its capacity to fight, its capacity to survive economically, but also the legitimization was a very important pillar. It's not surprising that the only emergency meetings the Israeli government had in the last 4 years were about delegitimization. Every Israeli foreign ministry official you meet will tell you that Israel is facing a campaign of delegitimization. Every ambassador in the West, including in this country, would say to you something they would never have said before. They are so happy to end their term in office in Britain, in Ireland, in Norway, because it was a horrible time. Wherever they went, people were criticizing them, barring them from speaking, and so on. So the moral pillar has been eroded, even if we don't notice it, has been eroded. And part of the reason it has been eroded, I think, has also to do with the way that the Palestinian struggle has been shaped and reshaped. And I think that, I'm not giving you a soundbite, but I think that I can understand the Palestinian national liberation struggle in the 1950s and 1960s, when you insist on your national rights. As I said, 3 generations later, it's not about national rights. It's about human rights. It's about civil rights. For all leaders of the Palestinian national movement, it's very difficult to accept the discourse of individual rights, of human rights, and civil rights. They still want national rights. I think that it's not a soundbite, but I think the more the agenda is about human rights and civil rights, we will kick out the moral pillar from below the Israeli edifice. There is nothing Israel can say on the basis of human rights and civil rights. If you ask the right to come back in the name of your nationality, you're not going to win. If you say it's my human elementary right to come back to my home, nobody can challenge it.
Exactly.
But how can we penetrate the Israeli psyche into the human rights of Palestinians? We have not won that argument yet. To penetrate the Israeli psyche, both right and left, of our human rights. That's fundamental.
That's the last basket. We have to start in the West. You have to start in the West and the rest.
Ilan, just one comment is that most of the people that I know, they don't know that Israel is a colonialist enterprise.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that you can say, that people don't understand Zionism as a colonialist enterprise and your people as a colonized people. And if you say that, maybe that requires education. We didn't know it in Israel.
Absolutely.
And I think the West has bought the Israeli narrative, and the West thinks like we used to think.
But we have to be optimistic. I mean, there is a new academic journal which is winning a lot of support, which is called Settler Colonialism. A very respected journal, comes out of Australia. And the most important case study that has been studied in this journal is Palestine and Israel.
It's academic.
But 10 years ago, if you wanted to enter in any academic journal a comparison of Zionism to colonialism, you would have no chance in the world of doing it. You penetrate the hegemonic discourse in the academia, in the media, in politics. In some areas it's easier, in some areas it's more difficult. You know, when you have a block of bricks, you don't go through the wall, you go through around the wall. You have no other choice.
I meant for the general public.
I agree. The dictionary of the general public about Zionism as colonialism, about human rights and civil rights is something, but it takes time, you know. And I remember in 1975 when Yasser Arafat was asked to give money to open a PR office in New York, he said, we don't need to waste money on this. We have the Soviet Union on our side. We told him that even the Viet Cong has a PR office in New York. What can you do? Palestinians took some time to understand that America is an arena to be won, not an arena to just leave it to others. Many things are changing. Many things are changing, and not all of them are negative. I think there's a lot of positive developments.
I think in regard to the discourse on the ground, in terms of people who are not heavily politicized, there's a whole different type of activists really sprouting out. You know, people who have heard through word of mouth, or who have found themselves on demonstrations, or who have gone to lectures, or who happen to know a neighbor who's very active. So it is filtering through, you know, in very plain, simple language, and the narrative is being challenged at that level.